Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, yesterday I was on a panel and we were talking about voting. And you had this young sister towards the end of the discussion when the panel was about to conclude. She ran up to the mic and she made some last minute comments about voting in response to what I said. And basically, this woman was saying that we shouldn't criticize people who don't vote. This woman was also talking about how by voting, people are consenting to the system of oppression. And, basically, she was suggesting that it's legitimate for people not to vote and that the voting doesn't change any, voting is not the means by which you change systems and all that kind of stuff. And she was trying to suggest that what I was saying is that all you have to do is vote. That's all we need to be focused on is voting to solve our problems. And that is not what I was saying at all. So in this video, I want to address why we must vote. And I want to respond to some of the things that the sister was saying. And I don't recall her name. I'm planning on doing some workshops today for work, and I want to talk about these issues as well, probably in more detail. But I felt the need to get on here and address this. And there was a subscriber of mine who basically asked me to address this issue, like to explain why we should vote. And that's what I want to do now. First of all, I reject the notion that voting means you consent to the system of oppression. In fact, I would say the opposite is true. By not voting, you're basically saying you're fine with the policies as they exist right now. You're fine with uh, the powers that be making the same decisions over and over again. You don't have any objection. You don't want to have any input. That's what you're saying when you say, you're. So I disagree with this notion that somehow you're co-signing, a system of oppression. It is through the vote that you can change various policies. I mean, we all studied civics. We all understand how government works, how you have three branches. You have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch is elected. These people are elected and they make the laws. They literally write laws that affect every single aspect of our lives. They affect how our tax dollars are allocated. They affect like what are the priorities of society. They affect like what kind of education our children will receive, what kind of social services will be available to the poor, like whether or not we'll have Section 8 for poor people who can't afford housing, whether or not there will be food assistance for hungry people. These basic things are decided by laws passed. It's laws that are passed through the legislative process that made it possible for us to have a Civil Rights Act, made it possible for us to have the right to vote, made it possible for us to have the bare necessities like the Fair Housing Act, which prevents these, discrimination in housing. All these basic rights that we take for granted. All these civil rights laws and regulations were enacted by elected officials. If you look at issues like police brutality, all those issues are shaped by who is elected into power. So if you want to have input on issues of police brutality, on crime prevention, on education, on very important issues like immigration, problems like the opioid crisis, issues of civil rights and job opportunities. If you want to deal with all those issues, the only way you can effectively deal with those issues and have, changes implemented in law is to elect progressive politicians that support the people's agenda. That's the only way you're going to affect those kinds of changes. And when I say the only way, I'm just talking about in terms of the legislative process, getting laws passed, because laws are used to secure rights, are used to determine the allocation of resources, determine basic things like even environmental justice, like the exposure to harmful elements in society. All of that stuff is determined by laws that are passed and passed and enacted. So it is important that we decide who is going to be our legislature. Who's going to be our member of Congress, who's going to be our senator. Those decisions matter, and that's why we must vote. Our elders and our ancestors who fought for civil rights understood that if they didn't have any kind of control over policy, then they would still be subjected to Jim Crow laws. Then they would still be reduced to second-class citizens, still forced to sit at the back of the bus, still forced to not go in certain places where no colors were allowed, still denied basic things like the ability to sit at a damn lunch counter or sit anywhere they want in the movie theater, basic rights, the rights that we take for granted. Like we travel and we're able to go to any hotel that we want to nowadays. But there was a time when black people couldn't even stay in a hotel. Basic things like that. They were denied those rights. But because of laws that were passed by elected officials, we have certain protections. We have certain rights. So we should never downplay the significance of the vote. And when I talk about the significance of the vote, I'm not saying that voting alone is the way that you create change in society. Of course, voting, for the reasons that I said, voting does impact policy and it does affect change, but you don't stop with the vote. I don't believe that the people should vote and chill, just go to the ballot box and cast a vote and then go home and that's the end of the process. Of course not. We need to hold elected officials accountable. Before electing people, we need to know what their agenda is. We need to find out if their agenda is in line with ours. And based on their agenda's alignment with our interests as a people, that's how we should decide who we're going to vote for. And even beyond that, instead of just being reactive, we can put forth our own candidates with their own progressive agenda, and support those candidates with our dollars. So we need to do it that way, financially support candidates, put forth agendas and present them to the politicians and hold them accountable for not adhering to those agendas. And we see this all the time with other groups of people. We see it with the gay and lesbian groups. They have an agenda and they, elect officials that support their agenda and they hold politicians that don't support their agenda accountable. Groups like the NRA do this as well. They grade politicians, and based on their grade, they decide which politicians they're going to financially reward with financial contributions and support, and they find out which ones they're going to oppose based on that. The same is true for the Zionist lobby. The same is true for, Latino groups that are lobbying for immigrant rights and other groups. Why should the African American community be any different? So, in addition to lobbying and supporting these candidates, there are other ways to affect change. So I'm not just saying that voting alone is the way that you affect change. There's still a need for protests when these leaders don't enact the laws that we want. When our rights are violated, there's still a need to protest in the streets. There's still a need for civil disobedience. There's still a need for all of that. There's still a need for radical change in society. And one way you can change society is through laws being passed. We can't say that this country is the same country it was during the Jim Crow era. It's not the same country, and our situation is not the same. We don't face the same kind of indignities to the same degree that we faced during the Jim Crow era when black people could be lynched with impunity. We don't face that same situation. We are not literally in bondage like our ancestors were when they were brought over here in slave ships. So there has been progress, and a lot of that progress is due to laws being enacted through the electoral process. And we would not even have the right to vote if you didn't have protest movements. So there's still a need for protests. There's still a need for boycotts. There's still a need to litigate as well. That's another way you can affect change, because the laws mean nothing if you're not going to have groups that are prepared to sue to enforce the laws. So that's another aspect. And then that brings me to the point of the judiciary. Like, elected officials appoint judges to these very key positions. And a lot of people see the Supreme Court. Yeah, obviously that's very important, but you also have the lower level federal courts, like the courts of appeals, the district courts. And through elections, you determine what kind of judges you have on those courts. And those judges rule on all kinds of things that affect our rights, our lives. They rule on all kinds of issues touching on civil liberties and all kinds of things. Issues like affirmative action. So elections are very important. They have very real consequences. We're seeing that Trump is putting all these judges on the federal courts that are going to have a lasting impact. These people are appointed for life on the Supreme Court, a Kavanaugh. I mean, the direction of the court is going to change fundamentally. So voting is absolutely important. It determines everything, like education, like the quality of the education that our children receive is based on who we elect in terms of the amount of funding that our schools get, compared to how much funding prisons get, the whole issue of mass incarceration. A lot of people talk about mass incarceration, but there were actual laws put in place that fed the problem of mass incarceration, that led to the problem of mass incarceration. And that, again, just proves how very important it is to participate in the electoral process. You had laws like the crime bill and stuff like that, laws that enacted, this huge sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, thereby resulting in large numbers of black men being incarcerated, black men and women being incarcerated, thereby destroying black families and black communities. These things have a very real impact on our community. When you look at the issue of affirmative action, an issue that is very important to the black community, affirmative action makes it possible for African Americans to get higher education, to go to law school, to go to medical school, to go to, graduate school, and to go to college, period. But now you're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to be hostile to affirmative action, with Kavanaugh being on there. They could possibly overturn those cases that said that affirmative action was constitutional, thereby closing doors of opportunity to our young people. So these elections matter, man. And when we look at like how police brutality is addressed, I touched on that earlier. On the local level, it's your district attorney who has the power to prosecute these police officers that kill our people. And if you're not participating in the process, you're not going to be able to elect the type of prosecutor you get. Like in Baltimore, we elected Marilyn Mosby, and she went out of her way and sacrificed everything to bring cases against those officers who were responsible for the killing of Freddie Gray. Now, it didn't have the result that we wanted, but she showed the courage to bring the case. And too often you have a lot of these prosecutors who are more concerned with cozying up to the police than addressing these very real issues of police brutality. So that's just another reminder of how important these elections are. Now, I want to go back to this issue of consenting to oppression. When you decide not to vote, you are basically saying, well, I'm going to let the most reactionary and backwards elements of society determine what kind of laws we have. I'm going to let that element of society determine how we're going to enforce those laws or how we're going to interpret those laws. That's basically what you're doing. You're turning over the reins of government to the enemy, to the very people that you claim to be so against. You're turning over the power of government to these people. Now, I saw this interview that was on the Today Show. They were interviewing this group called Identity Europa. It's a white supremacist group that's basically trying to infiltrate mainstream politics so that they can push forward their racist, white supremacist agenda on the low. Basically, that's what they're trying to do. They're going to college campuses, trying to recruit young people to infiltrate the Republican Party and take over the Republican Party. And we see that they have gained traction and influence. It's no coincidence that these white supremacists, so-called alt-right and all that kind of stuff, they use all these, it's no coincidence that these groups have influence in the White House. They had one of their own as the political strategist for the White House, Stephen Bannon. You know, there are people writing Donald Trump speeches, for instance, that are a part of that movement, that have been outed and all that kind of stuff. They have reigns of power. It's no coincidence that Donald Trump gave those white supremacists in Charlottesville a pass. So this stuff matters, man. Do you want those people empowered to elect a Donald Trump? You know, somebody that's openly hostile to the interests of black people. You know, somebody that views these white supremacists as some fine people. That's basically what you're doing. You're allowing those people to seize power. You know, you're allowing the white supremacists to be emboldened, to be empowered, etc. And it's no coincidence that you see all this stuff happening around the country. You actually have people emboldened because of Donald Trump's racist rhetoric, emboldened by it. And, you know, it's not just about, you know, some statements that Donald Trump made. It's about actual policies. When you compare the Obama administration to the Trump administration, it should be abundantly clear just how important elections are. If, for instance, you look at the approach to police brutality, that should be enough to wake people up. I mean, Donald Trump basically joked about police brutality during a meeting where he was with these police officers. He basically said, you know, why are you don't be worried about, you know, somebody's head when you put them into the car and stuff like that. You know, basically be rough with them and stuff. Encouraging police brutality in this environment where black people are being killed on a regular basis by these pigs and there's no justice. And then you have Donald Trump's own spokespeople saying that that's a local matter that should be addressed on a local level, basically saying it's a non-issue for the federal government. And then you have Jeff Sessions basically saying that we don't need to enter these consent decrees with police departments to end their discriminatory practices. Now you compare that to the Obama administration, an administration that entered many consent decrees with police departments to end discriminatory practices. They entered a consent decree in Baltimore, for instance, and Ferguson to end discriminatory practices. They were prepared to sue these police departments, but the Trump administration gives these people a pass. It's not a priority to him. You know, when Obama was in the White House, he talked about how Trayvon Martin could, if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin. He talked about that kind of stuff. He identified with the plight of black people. Now, Donald Trump couldn't give a half a damn about anything dealing with black people. So, you know, that's an example. When you look at the issue of voting rights, you have a Trump administration that is trying to suppress voter rights. You know, he set up a sham voter fraud commission, whose mission was basically to suppress black and Latino voters. Now you compare that to the Obama administration, an administration that went to court trying to defend the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County versus Holder case. They went to court trying to defend voting rights in Texas to get rid of that restrictive voter ID law there. So it's a night and day difference on that issue. When you look at criminal justice, Obama tried to deal with the problem of mass incarceration by not enforcing like mandatory minimums against nonviolent drug offenders, by you know, dealing with fair sentencing, by encouraging lawmakers to pass the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. So it just makes it clear, like the night and day difference. You have a Trump administration, the first thing that they did is they rescinded a lot of those policies so they could go back to this so called war on drugs. So these things are very important. Like, who is your president matters. So, Donald Trump is hostile to these various issues that are of importance to black people. When you look at social programs like food stamps and Section 8, Donald Trump is trying to get rid of those programs. The Obama administration allowed those programs to continue. Donald Trump is trying to cut back on student aid for struggling kids. I mean, like, I wouldn't have been able to go to college without financial aid, without certain grants and all that kind of stuff. He's trying to cut back on those types of programs that benefit black people. So these elections matter. I mean, do you want a government that openly embraces white supremacists like this Trump administration does? Well, that's what you get when you don't participate in the legislative process, when you don't participate in electoral politics. You are essentially surrendering your power. And you are doing a disservice to our ancestors and elders who fought for you to have that right. Again, they didn't just fight for the simple idea of just going to the ballot place for the sake of going to the ballot place, or to the poll place for the sake of going to the poll place. They fought because they wanted to have an impact on public policy, and one of the ways that you have an impact is through the electoral process. So we do them a disservice by saying that our vote doesn't matter. We do them a grave disservice. They went to jail for us. They were beaten for us, bitten by dogs for us. They faced the fire hoses for us. They even died for us. You had civil rights workers killed, like Medgar Evers, shot in front of his house. One of the key initiatives that brother was pushing for was voting rights. You had those civil rights workers in Mississippi killed trying to protect our right to vote. But yet and still, despite all these sacrifices that our people made for us to have this right to vote, you still have ignorant people telling you and me that our vote doesn't matter, telling me and you and me that we shouldn't vote. And those people, they are doing the work of the white supremacists by making those types of arguments. They are basically encouraging black people not to vote. So with those kind of people in place, you don't need voter suppression laws. You don't need white terrorist groups forcing black people not to vote when you have black people themselves, quote unquote, woke people, telling you not to vote. They are doing the work of the KKK. They are doing the work of these white supremacists and, right-wing Republicans that don't want us to vote. And yet these people want to claim to be freedom fighters. Yet these people want to claim that they're down for the people and all this and that. They have no clue. And as I've said before in my prior video, if our vote didn't matter, these people wouldn't go out of their way to suppress our vote. They wouldn't have, prevented us from voting for hundreds of years. They wouldn't have, terrorized black people and killed black people, shot black people for trying to exercise their right to vote, lynch black people and burn black people for that. If it didn't matter, they would just give it to you. They would let you have that vote. And they wouldn't be suppressing our right to vote today. I mean, you got states like Georgia that are putting a hold on 53,000 voters application, and 70% of them black. If our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't go out of their way to do that. If our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't stop a bus of elderly people in Georgia to prevent them from going to the polls. If our votes didn't matter, they wouldn't be passing these voter ID laws and citizenship proof laws and restrictions on early voting and other types of voter suppression tactics. If our vote doesn't matter, our vote matters, and we must vote if we want to make a difference in this society. So let me see what y'all are saying before I close out. Just 1 second. Yeah, I mean, we do need to counter, this right-wing agenda that this Trump administration is putting forth. So, I support. I just think that we need to support progressives. For me, it's not about like whether or not somebody's a quote unquote Democrat or not. It's about your positions on the issue. If your positions on the issues are in alignment with the interests of our people, then I will support you. If not, I don't support you. And sometimes that could be a Democrat. Sometimes, in rare cases, it could be a Republican. And in many cases, it's third party candidates. So we need to just make sure that we're informed about the issues and that we vote our interests first. We shouldn't be like focused on party, we should be focused on interests. So with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings to each and every one of you. If you have not registered to vote, please do so if you still have time for this election. Make your voice heard. Black votes matter.